Yo, it's the intro. Better grab your seat. Climate Microdose with cool and science meet. Jeremy and a host with the plan. This week, Alessa Berg, invest in the land. Microdose the climate, eco in the spotlight. Talking about nature, future's looking bright. Alessa dropping gems, you gotta tune in. Nature's the investment, let's begin. Back in the 90s, fresh vibes on the track. Talking about green, we ain't holding back. Protecting the earth, we on a mission. Tune in, folks, get some eco ambition. Jeremy's got the facts, Anna's got the flair. Alessa with solutions, nature love in the air. Climate microdose, hit you like a rush. Save the planet, y'all, ain't no need to hush. Eco thoughts like Pac, Biggie, Wu-Tang flow. Investing in nature, let the good seeds grow. Alessa drop the knowledge, make that green stack. Future generations planting life back. Microdose the climate, eco in the spotlight. Talking about nature, future's looking bright. Alessa dropping gems, you gotta tune in. Nature's the investment, let's begin.
Well, I don't know why the music resets, but hey, we're here. How awesome was that song?
Oh my God, my mind is still blown by the AI capabilities, and every time you do it, I'm still I have tears in my eyes. Truly.
I know. It's really funny because I will literally use that whenever my girls are in conflict and they're like, "Hey, well, she said this and she did this. Yeah, but she did this to me," and then I'm taking notes. And then I'll be in the car and then I'm like, "Hey girls, have you heard this song?" And they're like, "Dad, did you just make another AI song?" I'm like, if it promotes peace, I'm here for it.
The next level of not just parenting, but peacekeeping. You need to tell the UN about this.
Yeah, that's what we should do. Next Climate Week, let's just have a rap battle and solve the world's problems. This is the way we should do this.
That's it.
Anyway, welcome everybody. We're just over here having our own conversations, just like we always do.
We have a very exciting guest today.
Yeah, who's on the show today? Do we know her?
And kind of through the world, she's really how we met. Because I know we always talk this person's how we met, this person's how we met. But I have done a lot of work with her organization, Top Tier Impact. And her event that I was putting on during Climate Week is actually how we met. So in some ways, she created.
She's the orator.
Yeah. So Alessa Berg is the founder of Top Tier Impact, and she's here with us today. And she's a very special friend of mine, so I'm so happy to have her.
Well, that's not the screen that I wanted to show you, although it's very fancy with all kinds of really cool numbers. Yeah, this was what I wanted to do. I wanted to bring Alessa back in.
Are we going on a rap battle or what, guys?
Yeah, I mean, look, if it's on the table today,
I'm ready.
I think we should. You look very red today. I love this.
A whole cocoon.
Well, Jeremy, the world is on fire. What am I supposed to do with my background?
I'm with you. Yeah. Well, and speaking of the world being on fire, it sounds to me, from everything that I've seen you do over the past few years, that you're doing a good job of bringing the right people together. So we're really grateful to have you on the show today.
Yeah,
nice to be here, guys. So much context with both of you.
And I just saw that you sent out a newsletter about systems change versus new systems, which I love. So maybe we just kick that off because it's top of mind. I'd love to hear how you're thinking about systems change, how you're thinking about new systems, and just in general, the approach that you take to shaking things up, to calming the world down.
Right on. Yeah, you know me, Anna. Let's dive straight into that. So what I covered in this last newsletter, so system change is part of my background academically. I have a background in governance design, and I have always, since being a kid, been obsessed and super interested in thinking about our systems on this world, but not necessarily just from a science or biochemistry perspective, very much how we interact as humans, right? So governance and our economic system, how do they work and how do we improve them? right? And somehow I realized at some point becoming a grown up that it's not the usual question to ask. Somehow it's like, well, they're there, they're tough to touch, whatever. And that is just not good enough today because things come from the incentives we set, and we have evolved ourselves through technology, through tools, through these brains we have. So we have to think very carefully about the incentives that run our systems. So what I covered in this last newsletter, just to go straight into that as well, is system change versus system creation. So in system change, often we say, what is a better way of doing something? So if you take the example I gave, we have cars running on fossil fuel, and we may say, well, what's a better way to do that? Electric cars, right? So then we layer on top of the system another system. So we change it and we layer electric cars on top of it. If we ask a system creation starts with, what would the world look like if? So, what would the world look like if we didn't need cars, right? And you can do this with anything and everything. So maybe we can exercise here live today. But in this case, what would the world look like if cars aren't needed? Makes us think much more about the localization of our economies. And I think that the localization of our economies actually is a big, big, big theme. It's a big theme, as I said in the newsletter as well, for CO2 emission reductions, for bringing diversity and biodiversity back on the table, these being like a big factor that is getting us in the mess that we are in and increasingly are in. Localization of economies also means that we are more connected with each other. We can relate more with each other. It's easier to be kind. It's easier to be caring for a neighbor versus a person who's 5,000 miles away and they might be starving, but it's very abstract for us to understand. So anyway, that is the difference between system change and system creation from this angle. And I find it exciting to think about more questions with this system creation approach in the word.
I love it so much, and I wish that more people would think about that. I feel like we, especially here in the States, and something that Jeremy and I are so excited to have you on about is like the global perspective that you bring, because we're both in the States and it can be very hard to see kind of past the problems that we're facing here. So that's a whole nother conversation. But I really feel like in order to create change, it's not like just fixing the thing that's in front of us. And even our healthcare system, every single problem that we have, I feel like everybody just kind of thinks like, okay, how can we put a Band-Aid on it? How can we fix it now? How can we kind of just like shift it so that it works for today, instead of kind of future-based thinking, which is, what if we thought about a different way to do all of this and kind of scrapped not just the things that are not working, but also maybe the things that historically have fed us for millions of years and have worked, because maybe that's not what's going to carry us into this new kind of globalized community that we're all really starving for in a way. You know, I just saw this documentary, I've been talking about it nonstop, called Join or Die. And they interviewed the guy who wrote Bowling Alone, which was a very big book back in the 90s, all about how up until 1960, everybody in America was joining clubs and feeling like they're part of a community and really joining and getting together and feeling like I have a stake in what happens to you because I see you every day and you're my neighbor. And then after 1960, all of these clubs, they started going on a real downward spiral of people saying like, I'm not a joiner. I'm just going to have my own house, my own kind of individual existence. And that, exactly to your point, Alessa, disconnected us from each other and made us feel like what happens to me is only important to me. And I don't really care what happens to you because it doesn't really matter. And that's our neighbors. Think about what happens on like a global spectrum of what happens to people across the world. Does it matter to me? What happens in, China and Australia doesn't happen to me. And I think COVID really helped us understand that actually what happens to each and every one of us will affect us in the bottom line. And that just really brings me to the optimistics that I've been feeling around the Olympics and how like the just global games and everybody coming together, like that is the key, I think, to some of the success. And I guess my question to you is, do you think we have what it takes to do it? Like, what do you think needs to happen for us to start thinking about this differently?
Yeah, can we do a climate Olympics? That's what she's asking.
I would love
It's
that.
it's so funny, guys, so that we're having this conversation. Maybe we should coordinate on this, because when I was watching the Euro Cup, which, well, was more like watching the final and forcing myself to understand what's so fun about it, I did enjoy it, actually. So maybe there is a football fanatic in me after all.
That's funny.
But I have to say, my brain went straight to our space, right? And I was like, I was observing my experience. I was like, I'm getting passionate about this. Like, I'm actually kind of upset or happy depending
Mhm.
on where these ball rolls like around the field. So there's something going on. And then I started having a whole reflection about it. And I was like, what about like something like this for climate, right? So yes, we can double click on that. But just to get on your point, I love what you were talking about with the communities and what happened like 60s, 70s, 80s, as we actually started the globalization movement, and also the movement away from these kind of like more local centric structures and communities, because our brains are not designed to handle in general information as we get it today. That's like, a commonly understood fact. But our brains also struggle a lot with, oh my god, there's suffering here on this, other side of the world I don't know, and there's this storm going on over there. Like, it's very confusing and it's very overwhelming, and the main thing is that it gets frustrating because there's nothing we can do about it, right? Because if we are part of a community and we feel part of a community and we see that our neighbor is having an issue, there's something we can do. We are empowered to that extent, right? We can jump in and do our part. And so what I always say also within TTI, because TTI has this local and global aspect, and the global aspect is very mindful for specific reasons. It is about empowering each other and making each other also feel that there is a concrete contribution to be made. I think that the whole discussion around climate anxiety for teenagers and young adults, in my opinion, part of that comes from the fact that I remember myself when I was a teenager, when I was at university, I didn't get to work and add my contribution yet. Maybe I had side jobs, maybe I was doing some things, right? So you're not in that position yet that at least you can feel that there's something you can do. Now, we can obviously say, hey, there's lots of things that you could do anyway, right? You can obviously like volunteer for something, you can get internships, like you can do these things, but to a less extent than an adult can, in theory. And so I think that it comes down to us feeling like we can engage and make a difference, rather than being overwhelmed by a whole bunch of stuff that's going on out there that we don't understand, that we can't really relate to, and that just ends up disconnecting us even more.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's probably the case for most things. I mean, especially the climate, because it's like all we hear is these facts and figures, and even some of the most educated people have a hard time really digesting this. First of all, I would love for you to tell the audience what Top Tier Impact is, because you're the founder. We put up your website on the bottom there so everyone can see it. I would urge everyone to check it out, but maybe you could explain that to us. But then also, maybe could you share with us a little bit how you bridge that gap of understanding? Because, like I said, these are very intelligent people, and sometimes they can't always add up really what can they do. The question always comes up, big problem, what can I do about it?
Yeah, so Top Tier Impact is a global platform in the impact and climate investment space. And we have a few businesses, but the core of what we're known for and you guys are part of, and the context that you guys met each other through as well, is our network. So our network has members from 50 countries. We have 30 city chapters. We run our impact and climate events across all these cities in 5 continents, and also during global events like Climate Week that you mentioned before, Anna, like COP, like Davos. And so really the idea and the mission of Top Tier Impact is to accelerate the mainstream adoption of impact and sustainability. Really, it's the mainstream adoption of deep innate values that resonate with everybody, in my view, on a deeper level, right? Like being sustainable, and ideally more than sustainable, being caring, being impactful. So bringing this mainstream adoption of impact in the investment space and in the corporate world and in the entrepreneurial world, right? So it is a systemic mission of bringing impact into our paradigms that we operate through. There's an investment side, there's consulting, and there is a TV series that I was approached to do with Gaia TV, and that's actually coming out in a few months. It's finally done. Anna
Amazing.
knows that
Congratulations.
it's been a process, a learning process. But hopefully, with this, to your point, Jeremy, about also bringing, like, translating what's going on in climate and all these subjects of the impact space. Hopefully, what we can do with this TV series is bring to millions of people a much more relatable and exciting view of impact and climate from the entrepreneurial lens, right? From the human lens of, hey, I'm on this mission and here's what's happening and here's why I love it. Here's how you can get involved.
Amazing. Yeah, I think from the events that I've been to, it's always a really good mix of people who are actively looking for solutions, and I think that is the kind of thing that we need. I think going back to the climate Olympics, I mean, in many ways, there's a good side of competing, right? It's more like, it's less like competition, but more like co-opetition, where you're trying to find ways to work together with people, but you need competition to stay sharp, right? It's like if Anna and I are playing ball, we haven't done that, Anna, but if we did, it would be very competitive. I'm just letting you know. I don't play ball as much as I probably should because, I'm getting older. But yes, I happen to be very competitive. I don't know what it is. Me and my brother, especially when we were little, we could, I don't know, it could be like eating cereal. Who could eat cereal the fastest? I mean, there's always something to compete about. But I think in the climate space, it's good because it's like, look, we're actively trying to find these different solutions. And, a good friend of mine, Tom Chi, says nature doesn't plan, it rapid prototypes, right? Meaning that, we have to just try, iterate, because if we sit there and just pontificate forever, nothing will happen. And this was my frustration. And, Anna, you and I have talked about this on the show before, but, I'm very grateful for those who have invited me to speak at the UN over the years. But then I'd come back and people are saying the same things. And I'm like, well, what did we get done in the past year or 2 years since we've been together? And, I think it's great to see groups like Top Tier that say, look, let's set some intentions, let's set some goals, but then let's also hold each other accountable as well. And I think, that's absolutely admirable. And when we look at these types of things, it's great. One of the things I want to transition to, this topic of biodiversity keeps coming up quite a bit, right? And we hear about climate, we hear about, the oceans, are getting really warm. We're this year we're on track for one of the most worst weather for hurricanes ever recorded. Awful stuff. But biodiversity. Recently, you've had a lot of discussions about biodiversity. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And maybe I can tie it with what you mentioned just before, Jeremy, about competition. Because there is healthy competition and there is unhealthy competition. And healthy competition is actually how nature drives evolution. Things compete infinitely all the time in nature. What is the better solution? What is the better solution? Okay, iterate, right? That's part of like the prototyping process as well. So nature has embedded it to its core. And by the way, nature can also be very brutal, right? Like nature is not just like, oh, I'm smelling the flowers and I'm laying on the beach. Like nature can be like, whoa, okay, you were not paying attention, bird, you are out. So there is such a thing. And I think for us as human beings who observe their thoughts and get into all these abstract structures and concepts, there is this reconciliation we have to do, and that I think is actually very, very much at the root cause of things that are happening. Is this reconciliation between the body, so the instinct, the nature, right? The hey, you don't pay attention, like you're out of the game, like, and what's the best solution over and over, and just following the instinct, and then the mind. Right. And so there's this balance. I recently learned how these term of stewardship, like humans having stewardship over nature, so supporting nature, right? More of like a guardian type of role, because of having these kind of abstraction just from our instinct, is a term that used to be in the Bible and that was changed into dominion over nature. And so to get into nature and biodiversity, after this nice long parenthesis on competition that we will live there, the thing is, right now, when it comes to bringing capital into the nature space, there is so much more that could be unlocked. And there is a lot of work to be done around commonly understood frameworks, definitions, ways to measure things. Like in the climate space, we have CO2 emissions. It's not perfect, but it does the job in terms of mobilizing capital and aligning people on the same agenda, and then giving each other goals, right? Giving each other targets. The nature and biodiversity space doesn't have that. biodiversity is not straightforward to measure, obviously. So much data to crunch. There's the soil, and there's the air, and there's the fauna and the flora. There's so many things. At the same time, when you think about it, diversity is the very core of how nature thrives and nature is built, and we are as well. So thinking about how we embed this diversity, not just like how we preserve it in nature, but also how we preserve it in our structures. I talked about localization of economies just before. There is something within agriculture that's interesting to understand, because we have had for several decades this trend towards monocrop, and we are now paying the consequences in so many ways. Not going to go into it, but it can be, hours of discussion on its own. So we have that to deal with, and that is the exact sort of contrast to diverse agriculture, diversified management of soil, diversified crops, preserves naturally the biodiversity. You can have that, you have to have that in localized systems. If it's just, an economy of scale, an abstract economy where I produce food in country X and then I import it to the other side of the world, well, then it's fine to have monocrops. Is actually like the most logically right thing to do, economic thing to do. So biodiversity to me is a discussion that has a lot of different facets. And to recap it, there is the side of investing and unlocking capital. This is why we hosted our Nature Investment Summit last month. There is the side of preserving it in general for our own sake. And then there is the side of thinking about, well, how diversity more in general plays an important role in how we operate day to day with each other.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
think that's a great way of looking at it. And, something I think that you do really well and that I would love for you to talk about to our listeners is bringing these abstract kind of nature-based concepts like biodiversity into boardrooms, into financial capital markets, into people who are looking at like Excel spreadsheets and charts and numbers every day. And now we all of a sudden are in front of them like, okay, you have to think about biodiversity, you have to think about nature, you have to think about what this is doing to indigenous populations and all of the other things that we're so invested in the climate space. I feel like there's kind of like this divide between the conversations that we're having and the circles that we're really feeling each other in, and then the capital investment markets and like the venture capitals and the BlackRocks of the world. I feel like we talk about BlackRock a lot on the show.
I mean, they've got a lot of money out into in a lot of different things. So yeah.
And I think it's really important to start to bridge that divide, because we're not going to be able to do it in silos, one without the other. We need the knowledge from the indigenous side. We need the capital from BlackRock and all of their friends. We need to be able to walk together holding hands. And something that you've always inspired me in is your ability to bring that in and not feel like you can't be authentically yourself in front of, a boardroom, but you can also bring the reality of the capital and financial markets into rooms that are talking about maybe more of an emotions-based feeling that's happening with the loss of nature, like right in front of their eyes. So I'd love to just hear about how you think about that and how you've been approaching that as you unfold in Top Tier Impact and beyond.
Yeah, totally. This is something that to me just comes down to translation. And I love translating. And translation means so many different things, right? Translation can be the exact same message that I might be discussing with an indigenous tribe leader to be discussed with a corporate CEO. It's not necessarily about, oh, you can't share it. It's just like digesting it and sharing it in a way where the context and the core message is understandable. So I enjoy that. And I think that perhaps it's embedded in how I generally operate in the world, like speaking different languages, like being Swiss Brazilian, like translation is something to me that has to happen all the time. And I've always had like these kind of varied perspective on things. Like there's not just one way of looking at it. There's just infinite perspectives. So I really enjoy that. And that is also where these work of getting different stakeholders to see, hey, we're actually all approaching the same thing. We all want the same things as well. So how do we cooperate? Because especially at this point in time today, it's not that we have many other choices. So how do we really bridge the gap, understand each other, and cooperate?
I love that.
Yeah, no, I think that that in theory is great, but I think a
Understand?
lot of people have had a hard time actually implementing that. Like, what would you say in in your experience would be some successes of that? Because it's not like it hasn't been tried before.
Yeah, that was my question too. Like, what is some pushback that you're getting when you're coming into the rooms with that kind of energy?
Mm. So I think that, successes can literally be the investment rounds of any of these climate startups, nature startups, like all the startups in our space that constantly need to translate. Those are success stories. Other success stories are the GPs and the fund managers of new impact and climate funds that need to go and pitch their own investors, right? It's a food chain after all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to kind of like hit the spot. I know that there are a lot of opinions about this, and I myself tend to point out the systemic issues in this food chain. But those are success stories, right? Like
Yeah.
those are these translation stories as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, typically, in these situations, it's more like what is not landing, what is not resonating here, and what framework is the other side coming from. So we could go into some examples, but just in terms of covering your question on success stories, like literally, like across this chain, and then various other examples out there of partnerships. I think at this point, when it comes to impact and climate, every kind of partnership, success story, like new company creation, sale, like all of that is an example of this translation as well.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I'm curious too because it's like, well, if you're also having a conversation with like the corporates of the world and the investors, and then you mentioned indigenous groups as well.
Mm-mm.
When we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about investments. I mean, there is this conversation about putting a value on nature. Sometimes people understand that. I mean, that's the theme of today's chat today is like can you put a value on nature? And how do you respond to indigenous communities that hear that kind of talk from the corporate
Mm.
world and explaining it so that it's a unifier as opposed to a divider?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that with uh, before I dive straight into that, with listening and listening to each other, there's always like the listening to really understand and to feel the other person versus like listening with wanting to get an outcome, right? Or wanting to get a point through. Or, in a more simple way, like listening to the heart or listening with it, right? So for me, it's not necessarily about that, but it's more about I mean, that's a big part of it. But I would say an even more important part today is to try and actually bring across the reasons why these, from let's say our perspective and my perspective, is something important.
Hmm.
So, in the case of communicating it with people living deeply, deeply integrated in nature and tribes. And I'm going to be myself in the Amazon jungle in like 10 days from now. So when it comes to communicating it like that, it's about first acknowledging and understanding the other point of view. Because I'm on the same page, by the way. I mean, I would love to live in a world where we do not need to put a price on nature, guys, because we have evolved beyond having to operate how we operate. And, we are in harmony with nature. I would love that. 100%. Sign me up. Get me on the next ship to that virtual reality trip. So, of course, like that would be idea. But when we look at the reality and the reality that we have today, the fact is that if we don't put a price on something in our current economic system, it means it has a value of zero. And this is something that comes from about 400 or 500 years ago. Concepts about nature that were inserted by philosophers like Francis Bacon during the Renaissance, saying nature is infinitely available, therefore
Mm-hmm.
has a value of zero. Humans have dominion over nature, like all of these things. And the fact that then we treat it as commons and we don't price negative externalities such as pollution, such as natural resource consumption into our economic system has consequences. So I think it's important to agree on the starting point, right? Because we all want the same thing here. We all want to live in a world where we are in harmony with nature, in harmony with each other, and in harmony with ourselves. However, today, here's how things are. Therefore, because things are like this today, here is how we can approach them. Here is how we can improve them. Here is how we can eventually, to my point on system change versus system creation, create a new paradigm. So that's how I tend to go about it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
100%. I really feel like because we treat nature like that, as it has no value, that trickles down into the way that we see ourselves and the way that we see our value and the way that we see our familial kind of place in the world. And I really feel like living with that kind of mindset is kind of derivative of the climate change problem that we're seeing right now. So it's a cycle, right? If I don't see the value in nature, I don't see the value in myself. I don't see my possibility to spark change. And then it's going to go on and on and on. And I'm going to treat the resources around me as expendable, like they don't matter. And I'm also going to treat the people that I meet, whether they're like me or not, and even less so if I feel like they're different from me, right? Like that diversity piece, which we talked about earlier, it really trickles down into like the socioeconomical way that we view ourselves and our communities, right?
Yep.
So I really feel like even though these two things are operating on different levels, it's all part of the same problem. And it's all part of the value that we're placing on our planet and our place in this world, you know? And if you just take a second to look around and see how amazing it is that we're here and that we made it, like that your parents met somehow and that you're here, I just think it's absolutely amazing. And that happened to every bird, every, lizard, every single being on the planet. Although I'm not really sure how lizards reproduce. So let me get back to you on that one. They might do something different. And none of this could exist if the planet wasn't here. Right? Like you couldn't have a financial market. You couldn't ding the bell at Wall Street if there wasn't a planet to do it on. So for me, just doing this work, it's just become so apparent that the planet is number one, because without the planet, there's absolutely nothing else.
Right.
And then from there, you build the value, right?
Well, Aristotle.
Part.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to your points, both of you, Aristotle said that which is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care. Men pay most attention to what is their own. They care less for what is common. And that's really what we're talking about today, Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was like, oh, this is perfect. this is what happens on the show. Anna and I just geek out.
So 100%, guys. I mean, I think that the part of the connection and disconnection that we have to nature, it's actually the connection or disconnection that we have within ourselves, right?
Yeah.
And the mirror of inside and outside, because we are nature. And, I still have to talk about this because even so, to me, it's like, it's so natural. It's like, why do we even have to explain this? But like the amount of times that it's explained and somehow it's like a big aha moment or light bulb is phenomenal. And so, still to cover this point, we are nature. I mean, we are made of the earth. We're 70% plus water. We eat dirt and stuff that comes from the earth every single day. So what is this? It's that, right? And sure, we can then argue about how our brain works and whatever else, like biochemistry, part of nature. So this is where we often get sort of like disintermediated from us versus nature. I think this narrative is a fundamental problem. When you listen, I've just started rereading the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and it's so beautiful to, these kind of texts, they can land deeper every time you read them. And he talks about nature in a way that the Tao Te Ching from the Taoists talk about nature as well, probably influenced by that, right? Because we don't know how much of a translation and communication there was, but they talk about nature in this way that is like, we are nature. Following nature is what's natural. Understanding and observing how the nature around us works is what can allow us to live better within ourselves and with interactions with each other. So yeah, of course, the connection and the way that we relate to nature is a reflection also of how we relate to ourselves.
Yeah, 100%. And you're right. It's interesting how many people haven't turned that light bulb on. right?
Mm.
It's crazy to me because, I talk about this every day, and the biomimicry piece that you just mentioned in terms of learning from nature and turning that into our business models and the way that we solve problems. The answers are already kind of in front of us in a lot of ways. All we need to do is like be present enough to look. And it's so interesting that a lot of our predecessors, the ancients, had a lot of this knowledge already and were building systems based on how nature flowed and what worked and what didn't work and around the sun and the moon and the stars and their observations in the sky, right? So it's just interesting how they had it right and we think that we're so much further advanced than them, and then yet somehow it's become lost in translation, and we've landed at this kind of crisis point now, and we're looking back into like, oh no, what have we been doing? How can we get back to that? How can we get back to localized communities? So
100%. It's funny you mentioned this because one of the first reflections that I had as I started rereading the meditations was, oh my goodness, the fact that we somehow think we are at the most advanced point in time just because our tech is fancier. Like, what about the way that we live literally and the emotions we experience every day? Because, yeah, I would trade anytime extra fancy tech, even the AI generated songs that you guys so lovingly put at the beginning of, I would happily trade that for politicians who follow the principles in things like meditations or the Tao, whatever, right? Like I would trade that any time of the day.
Yeah.
So I was
Yeah.
listening to this and I was thinking to myself, my goodness, like politicians, so to say, like rulers at the time, were writing this, distilling such intense knowledge. Like, what are politicians writing today? I mean, obviously it depends where we're looking, but we're not quite at the same place. So 100% agreed
yeah,
on that.
I just want to point out we don't know what kind of technology the Egyptians had. I'm pretty sure it was fancier than anything that we can possibly think of today.
Wait, you mean it wasn't aliens?
We have a question from the audience.
Yeah,
I
we
can
have.
talk about Egypt for days. Everybody.
Actually, Neil deGrasse Tyson recently just posted that the pyramids were not made by aliens. So I'm sorry, History Channel, when the guy with the messy hair.
No, it wasn't aliens. They just had a different technology. We have to talk
I know
offline about
that's
this.
a whole nother subject for a whole nother time. Stan Chen wants to know, how do we bridge this financing gap, especially in the context of COP29, the climate finance COP, and accelerate building valuation models for nature externalities?
Well, I have a very simple suggestion that
Oh,
just comes like right there, which I covered also in our weekly newsletter because I brought up the fact that we still have about $7 trillion of annual subsidies going to fossil fuels. And the gap that we currently have in climate financing global is about 3 to 5 trillion. 1.3 trillion is invested. So we are missing, depending on how you look at it, 1.7 to 3.7 trillions. So maybe a fraction of those fossil fuel subsidies could be conveniently invested on this side instead, just for starters, right? And I can give you a lot of other explanations and
no,
answers to it.
that's a fair point. I
But
mean, that the same
yeah,
goes for fishing subsidies.
yep.
It's all the
The
same.
same goes for so many things,
Yeah.
military, corporal,
Yes.
yeah. But it just matters where we put our time and attention, right? And that goes back to what we were talking about, what we're putting value on, and how people are living their lives follows where the money goes, right? In advertising, which is my background, we really see what people are caring about and what they're spending their time and attention on, and that's what they're going to spend their money on, right? So you're able to kind of like really follow that through, but it starts with every single one of us and what we care about and how we're spending our time. And a lot of us think that the most precious resource is the money in our bank account, but it's really our time and attention. That's something that you can't really get back, is the time and the minutes that you're spending and the energy that you're putting in at each specific moment and what you're thinking about, what you're bringing into the world, and sure, what you're spending your money on, but also what kind of world are you bringing in every single minute. And I really think that is the key to changing everything, but that is a huge undertaking and we're trying. We're trying.
No, I mean, I think that goes back to the other comment we talked about. It was like, you can't possibly sit there and engineer these things. You have to try, you have to fail, you have to iterate, and you have to keep doing that over and over. What was it? What was the? I remember a quote years ago. Richard had said, "Show me a person that has never failed, and I'll show you a person who has never tried." And all of us have failed, but it's also failing forward. There's other ways of looking at it. So I think that, it's not always evident when we set out to do something, and I think that goes back into an investment. I was on a investment call yesterday, and this guy he invests in funds of funds, essentially. So all the big funds that we all know of that invest in ocean and climate, which I'm not going to name because it would give away who this individual is, but he's the one that puts money into them. And he said, look, when you invest in things, especially things like this, you have to take risks. You know that you're going to fail. You know that you're going to lose money. But if you don't take those risks early on, then you won't have those really big unicorns, as they call them, the ones that really blow up and become something. But by the time that you've waited for all of the things to happen to where it's the perfect investment, the reward is not as great. And so, I see this market. This reminds me, unless when this is something I said at your event in New York at Climate Week. I came from the .com world, and I was the number 5 employee of a startup that became the world's largest web hosting provider. It was in the .com world, right? And yeah, we had electricity that was flowing through our brains. We were on the NASDAQ. It was amazing. This is bigger than that. And it's really hard, sometimes for people to understand that. But there were times where I would show up, people say, well, what do you do for work? I say, well, I work at an internet provider. And they say, oh, but when are you going to get a real job? This is a fad. It's not going to go anywhere. Right? And, here we are live streaming on the internet, right? So I do think that the work that you're doing is super important. And we will get to a spot where we're like, man, you remember when? What was that turning point? And I think this is all the things that you discussed today is that turning point.
And I was talking with someone yesterday about the immediate or the urgency effect and how we either feel it or we don't. Because I think the climate space still has a big problem with this. Because climate itself is a complex hyperobject. That's actually how you technically describe something like climate. Very tough to relate to it. Yeah. Like, what is climate anyway? And what is the climate crisis? And what is climate change? So out of that, if you compare it to COVID, right? Because a lot of people are like, wow, we responded like pretty rapidly to that. Well, with COVID, you can see the impacts. You can see the effect. Oh, they're ill. They're closing the space, like whatever. Or this movie that someone was suggesting the other day. I haven't seen it yet. It's called Don't Look Up.
Yeah. Great movie,
you guys might have seen it. And so there's like these asteroid coming to Earth. And actually, I think that the scenario they created, I'm sure it's super entertaining, but in a way it doesn't make sense in the sense that this is immediate at least. It's like, there is a freaking asteroid that's going to come down here. So whatever we got to do, let's do it, right? Whereas in the climate space, still to translate it, to make it these obvious, these clear, like COVID, like an asteroid coming our way or whatever it is, like we are still figuring that out. Yeah. So that goes back to translation and narratives.
100%. And we're starting to experience it more and more. And maybe that's what we're going to need to shake things up and help people turn on that light bulb, as we say. And I think that's a great place to end it. And, Alessa, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're so happy to have you. You're one of my favorite people walking this earth, and just keep spreading the light and keep doing the work that you're doing because it's so, so important. And, Jeremy and I, we're here and we're doing it. We just want everybody to microdose on climate. So here we are.
Microdose on climate. I love it. I love the title of the show. Guys, such a pleasure. This was super fun as always.
No, it's great to have you. Thanks, Alessa, for joining us for sure.
So much. Yeah. All right.
Well, I think having amazing human beings like Alessa on the show is exactly what we need. I mean, this is a human being. For those of you that are just now learning about Top Tier and who Alessa is, what she's doing, like, this is no small feat. Like, it's not any small task to bring human beings together to try to figure out how they can coexist in places. I mean, look, we come from an era, especially in the tech world, where, hey, I have this idea and it's mine. I remember years ago, a professor saying, let me tell you what intellectual property is. And he blew into a balloon. He goes, all this air is mine. Well, what made it yours? You sucked it in from somewhere else and blew it into this balloon. And it's like, you know, how do you break that? And every time I go to these top tier impact groups, it's amazing to see how these borders are just literally being crossed. So it's really awesome to have somebody like Alessa on the show.
Exactly. And she just does such a great job at bringing people together. And whenever you're in these rooms, you feel like you can finally take a deep breath because you don't have to keep explaining yourself like we've been talking about. And she does a great way of translating that. And even just thinking about that word translation that she mentioned, I think it's a great way to go forward and a great, you know, thing for the audience to think about. Whatever it is that you're grappling with, if you keep hitting a wall, just think about talking in that person's language and how you can explain it to them in a way that feels relevant. You know, maybe it's like you bring in a metaphor, maybe it's you bring in something that's happening in the real world or in their family life or, you know, wherever it is. We're all people. And I think that if we just spend some time really trying to understand each other, we would get a lot further.
We would, absolutely. Well, this has been an amazing Climate Microdose. I want to tell the audience that I have another video that's coming out the next few hours. It's about deep sea mining. Ooh. 32 countries at the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica right now have actually opposed deep sea mining and said that they support a moratorium. Today's video that will come out is about we've talked about all the bad things relating to deep sea mining. But what you might not know that I'm going to show you today, we're going to actually pull in a paper. We're going to get nerdy. And we're going to go into the deep dive on this. But they're radioactive. Did you know Did you know that, Anna? Did you know that there's uranium and other types of?
Call it the deep dive with Jeremy McCabe because you've been doing.
You know, I'm a dad, so I'm good for the puns, right?
Like, that's perfect. And yeah, tune in for Jeremy's deep dives. He's so knowledgeable and he really, really cares. So it's a great way to learn about what's going on. And I can't wait to learn more myself about what's going on in Jamaica. I've been hearing a lot about it. So tune in for that. And we can't wait to see you next time. Thank you so much for tuning in. This has been another Climate Microdose.
Another Climate Microdose. And we're going to end with Anna's song that we had from last week. So here we go. Thanks, everybody, for watching.
Thank you so much.
In the house, yeah, she's got the flow. Talking about the earth and the way we grow. Climate change, biodiversity, let's go.